this video, I will show that Jimmy Akin, senior apologist at Catholic Answers, denies that Christ has two natures and is actually a polytheist. I will examine his book, Teaching with Authority, which details his opinions on Catholic teaching, heresy, and when a person becomes a heretic. I will illustrate how his beliefs are strikingly similar to Mormonism, and show how he isn't even Christian by his own standards. I will then expose Dr. Taylor Marshall, the supposed traditional Catholic, and show how he makes the same errors as Akin and also promotes polytheism. I will discuss the theological status of Vatican II and its heresies. Finally, I will show how this crisis mirrors the Arian crisis, and how it's a sign of the apocalypse and the great apostasy, the prophesied final crisis of the Church that precedes the second coming of Christ. Normally, I would refer to Catholic Answers as quote Catholic Answers, since they're not actually Catholic. But in this video, I will refer to them as Catholic Answers, to avoid encumbering the video. It's important to understand the current landscape regarding those who follow the Vatican II Church. Within it, there's a political/ideological spectrum that spans from the left to the right. On the liberal side, there's quote Father James Martin, notorious for pushing the LGBT agenda. To the right of Martin is quote Bishop Robert Barron, who believes in hopeful universalism/Balthasarianism, a heresy which states that perhaps all men are saved. To the right of Barron is the middle, where Catholic Answers resides. Further to the right is Michael Voris of Church Militant, Michael Matt of The Remnant, Timothy Gordon, and Dr. Taylor Marshall. Catholic Answers, being right in the middle, is in a convenient position that gives them wide outreach, both to the left and to the right. For example, someone more liberal, like Barron, will appear on their show, while simultaneously people more conservative, like Dr. Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon, will praise them.
People like Catholic Answers, good people.
Timothy Gordon, host of the Rules for Retrogrades podcast, used to contribute articles for Catholic Answers, and Taylor Marshall has appeared on their show and referred to it as one of the best shows on the radio. And Michael Matt, right-leaning editor of The Remnant, said they do a, quote, terrific job.
Now, everyone knows that Catholic Answers is an organization of lay apologists whose stated mission is to defend the church and defend the faith. They do overall a terrific job doing just that.
Since Catholic Answers is respected across the ideological spectrum, they are very significant, and Jimmy Akin, its senior apologist, is a key personality in the world of those claiming to teach Catholicism. One of the devil's primary strategies during this time of great confusion is to distort the meaning of key terms. He has accomplished this goal by using his human instruments to dilute key terms, such as Catholic and heretic. Catholicism is the true religion, and what defines and constitutes being a true follower of Christ is of the utmost importance, since there's no way to heaven except through him. True followers of Christ accept all the dogmatic teachings of the Catholic Church. Those who reject one or more of these teachings are heretics. The terms Catholic and heretic are mutually exclusive. Pope Innocent III, Eius Exemplo, quote, by the heart we believe and by the mouth we confess the one Church, not of heretics. For decades, people have misused the terms Catholic and heretic. They're so frequently misused that erroneous concepts like, quote, cafeteria Catholic have arisen. A, quote, cafeteria Catholic is a person who claims to be Catholic, who obstinately rejects a part of dogmatic Catholic teaching. So, in reality, the term cafeteria Catholic is just a misnomer for heretic. Why, then, is the term so widely used? In general, it's used because of people's desire to be well-liked and fear of offending others. And for these people, Akin lays out numerous lines of false argumentation that can be used to rationalize any amount of dissent from Catholic teaching. For example, Akin claims that it's basically impossible for anyone to be obstinate. And he also claims that infallible Catholic teachings only apply if the laity accept them over time. Starting with this false understanding of obstinacy, Akin believes that Protestants aren't heretics. This is from his book, Teaching with Authority. Quote, although Protestants have been baptized and do doubt or deny Catholic dogmas, they typically do not do so out of bad faith, and thus don't meet the requirement of obstinacy. Vatican II remarked, the children who are born into these communities cannot be accused of the sin involved in the separation. According to Akin, a Protestant who has heard some teachings of the Catholic faith and denies them for decades is excused on the grounds that they grew up that way. He turns obstinacy into a nearly impossible to fulfill requirement. This is wrong. It's been held all throughout Catholic history that those who resist Catholic teaching are heretics. Canon 1325, 1917 Code of Canon Law. Quote, after the reception of baptism, if anyone, retaining the name Christian, pertinaciously denies or doubts something to be believed from the truth of divine and Catholic faith, such a one is a heretic. St. Thomas Aquinas also said something similar. Contrary to canon law and Aquinas, Akin holds that one is excused from heresy if they grew up in a heretical sect. He also cites Vatican II to bolster his claim. But what does he think of Martin Luther, the founder of a major Protestant sect, a man who was formally excommunicated for heresy by Pope Leo X? Akin actually recommended that his readers get Luther an indulgence, meaning he professes that Martin Luther could be in purgatory. He said, quote, wherever Luther is now. According to Akin, Martin Luther, one of the most obstinate heretics to ever live, and the founder of a major Protestant sect, could have been saved. In addition to elevating obstinacy to a nearly impossible to fulfill requirement, Jimmy Akin also makes the criteria of a dogma impossible to fulfill. He discusses the theological reasoning of James Martin, who cites the Vatican II document Lumen Gentium to promote the idea that if the, quote, faithful, that is to say, lay people who claim to be Catholic, don't accept a teaching, then that proves that the teaching wasn't actually an infallible teaching. Listen to this from his book, where he discusses Martin's theology. Quote, today opinion polls reveal widespread rejection by Catholics of its teaching on contraception, and some consequently argue this teaching has not been received by the faithful and therefore isn't authoritative. This argument has been advanced by Father Charles E. Curran. Father James Martin has proposed a similar argument concerning homosexual behavior. Akin promotes Martin's heresy and also makes it explicit that he, in fact, agrees with Martin's theology. That is to say, Akin believes that for a teaching to be infallible, it must be, quote, received by the faithful. This is from his book. Quote, setting aside the specific issue of contraception, it should be pointed out that the process of reception is just that, a process. The Holy Spirit takes time to do His work in guiding the faithful. Akin is again totally in error. Dogmas do not go through a, quote, process of reception. They are declared by the Church, and their meaning must be preserved. Pope Pius IX, First Vatican Council, Session 3, Chapter 2 on Revelation, quote, hence, also, that understanding of its sacred dogmas must be perpetually retained, which Holy Mother Church has once declared, and there must never be a recession from that meaning under the specious name of a deeper understanding. Akin makes the criteria for dogma impossible to fulfill because, according to him, one could always believe or argue that the, quote, faithful haven't received the teaching yet, and perhaps they won't, so it might not be infallible. He affirmed his belief in this heresy in the context of James Martin's defense of homosexual behavior. He leaves the door open that perhaps Martin is right, and will have to wait for the, quote, process to run its course. Akin excuses basically every originator, proponent, or believer in heresy. As a result of this, he believes that basically every heretical group that claims to be Christian is actually Christian. He rejects the dogmatic teaching that only Catholicism is Christianity, and only Catholics are actual Christians. This is from his book, Why Mormonism is Not Christian. Quote, Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and other Eastern Christians are all Christians. They share different degrees of unity, and they may be separated brethren, but they are still authentic brothers in Christ. Although he excuses all kinds of heretics, he left a key exception: the Mormons. His position on Mormonism is very inconsistent with his other principles. He claims that Mormons are not Christians and doesn't give them the same leniency as he does with the Protestants or the Eastern quote Orthodox. He even wrote a book titled Why Mormonism is Not Christian, and advised people not to vote for Mitt Romney in the 2012 election because of Mitt's Mormonism. Akin condemns Mormons because they corrupt the nature of God to the point of polytheism. This is apparently too much for him, and he unhesitatingly labels them non-Christians. According to him, polytheists are automatically not Christians. He's correct on this point, but his conclusion does not follow logically from his methodology. Now here's where things get interesting. You see, Akin wants to be seen as a sophisticated intellectual and engage with pop culture and pseudoscientific theories like the multiverse and aliens. He knows that if he condemned these theories, he would be seen as narrow-minded and boring. So instead, he warps Catholic teaching around them, and eventually this morphed into overt polytheism. Jimmy Akin discusses these theories at length in his podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which is promoted by Catholic Answers.
Jimmy, I'm very curious now. You just mentioned to me before we came on the air that we could talk for a moment about Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. It's a new podcast you have.
On this program, Akin discusses a wide range of topics, including the multiverse, aliens, paranormal phenomena, and so on. He claims to give a Catholic perspective on these topics. Listen to his co-host, Domenico Bettinelli, do the intro to the show.
You're listening to episode 25 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason.
In an episode titled Mystery of the Multiverse, Akin discusses the idea of living in a multiverse and gives his opinion on whether or not it contradicts Catholic teaching. The multiverse is a theory that states that there are multiple universes, and we live in only one of these universes. Some versions of the theory even postulate that there are an infinite amount of other universes. These other supposed universes are sometimes referred to as other dimensions or parallel worlds. There are different variations of the multiverse theory, but Akin divides it into 4 main categories.
So just quick review. Type 1, our universe extends infinitely and you under the same laws and you get repetitions eventually. Type 2, every possible combination of laws applies to some universe. Type 3, every possible timeline happens. And type 4, every mathematically or logically possible state of affairs happens.
Okay.
In a type 4 multiverse, Akin says every logical possible state of affairs happens.
And type 4 is basically the proposal that every possible mathematically describable universe exists. And this is basically equivalent, as I understand it, to saying every logically possible state of affairs exists somewhere out there. And so for example, I mean, we mentioned unicorns and aliens. Any bizarre thing you can imagine happening, as long as it doesn't involve a logical contradiction, it's out there. Things like square circles and four-sided triangles are not out there because they involve logical contradictions.
Catholicism does not allow for the belief that every imaginable state of affairs exists in a different pocket of reality. This is because the truths that the Church has defined are not compatible with every imaginable universe. In an attempt to justify that this multiverse theory is compatible with Catholicism, Akin denies free will. He comes up with a convoluted theory where every time a person makes a choice, a new universe is created where an alternate version of the person makes the opposite choice. While musing about this theory, he twice casts doubt on the dogma that man has free will.
The only place it gets a little more interesting is with different multiverse types is with different timelines, because you could conceptualize this as there's one original timeline which then splits when we make a choice. And so let's say on my deathbed, I get up to my deathbed in one, and I make a choice in one timeline to embrace God's love and be saved. And in another timeline, I make the choice to reject God's love and be separated from him. Okay, what's my eternal fate? Well, at that point, it would seem I've just twinned. And there are now two versions of Jimmy Akin. This is like what we have happening in the womb when identical twins are created.
Right.
You originally have one zygote. That's why these are monozygotic twins. You have one zygote that then splits to become two different people. And in that case, I was one person. This is the same process, just it's happening at the other end of life. If I'm on my deathbed, you had a version of me that then twinned with this choice, and one twin ends up going to heaven and one twin ends up going to hell. So that would be very interesting. But it wouldn't fundamentally contradict anything in the Christian faith. It would just mean twinning can occur in a different way than we had previously realized.
So a couple of questions come up with that, which is one is that would mean that because all possible decisions exist, that means that
if it means that, if it may not necessarily, because if we have free will, we may not. There may be no version of us where we choose to reject God's love. We might simply make the choice to embrace God's love, and there might not be a version of us making that other choice if we have free will.
Akin, with no hesitation, cast doubt on free will. He apparently doesn't care that the Council of Trent dogmatically defined that man has free will. But as unbelievable as that statement is, it gets worse. In the following clip, he misrepresents St. Thomas Aquinas and claims St. Thomas believed that there could be a multiverse, which is false. In the Summa, Aquinas actually addresses the question of multiple worlds and answers that there's only one world.
Is there anything left to talk about with faith?
One more brief point. Let's think about type 4 multiverse for a second, where every logically possible state of affairs happens. Mm-hmm. Well, since they're logically possible, God can make them. And therefore, God could actualize. Now, the Bonaventure, William Lane Craig folks might disagree with this and say he couldn't do it for all of them. But I'm on the St. Thomas side. I would say God can make infinite collections, and therefore, God could actualize every logically possible state of affairs.
I paused the clip here because what he says next is astonishing. He says that it could be that in other universes, Jesus didn't incarnate.
Would that contradict Christianity? Well, no, it wouldn't. But there would be universes where Jesus didn't incarnate.
To say that there are other universes where Jesus didn't incarnate is to deny that Jesus has two natures. Jesus has both a divine and human nature. Akin promotes the idea that Jesus has a human nature in only our universe. This is a severe corruption of one of the most fundamental truths of Christianity. Not only that, but he thinks God may have made completely different religions for other supposed creatures in other universes. He says that perhaps in these other universes, reincarnation may exist and be a part of the true religion of that universe.
Or where God chooses to have reincarnation instead of resurrection happen. It would just mean God set up other rules for other people out there. But we live in an area of the multiverse where God chose to incarnate and where he chose to have resurrection rather than reincarnation be our eternal destiny. And so we live in a universe where Christianity is true. And so where God implemented Christianity. And so Christianity is true. And it's what applies to us here. The idea of God creating other universes with other rules, including other religious rules, that's up to God.
What Akin promotes here is not only a denial of the incarnation, it's actually polytheism. To say that Jesus only incarnated in this universe, but in another universe he didn't, is to split the divine person of Jesus Christ and be a polytheist. Think about it. According to him, it's true in our universe to say that the second person of the Trinity has two natures, but in another universe, such a statement would be false. Not only does Akin think that there might be different universes where the second person of the Trinity doesn't have two natures, but he also thinks Jesus may have incarnated multiple times in this universe. In a segment that originally aired on Catholic Answers, called Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, he says that God might have also incarnated as an alien on another planet.
Okay. And so if the aliens are fallen and say, "Oh, we don't want to be saved," well, then they're in the same category as the angels. But if they say, "Oh, yeah, we want to be saved, we want to be saved through Jesus," then the presumption would be they can be. Now, it's also possible, though, that they could have been saved through other means, because God might have a special, different way for them to be saved. Maybe involving an incarnation on their planet.
All right. Okay.
If this were true, then Jesus would have three natures instead of two. He would have a divine nature, a human nature, and an alien nature. That's impossible and heretical, since it's a dogma that Jesus has two natures. Jesus can't have two and three natures simultaneously, nor can he have two natures just in our universe. To promote this idea is to separate Jesus' humanity from his divine person, and to deny the truth of the incarnation. Now, think about his theory. Under Akin's blasphemous premises, what if the alien incarnation and the human incarnation were in the same room at the same time? Which one would Akin worship? The one with two natures, one divine and one human, or the alien one? Akin's theory necessitates multiple gods, one for each incarnation. This is polytheism. And since he believes that there could be an infinite amount of universes in the multiverse, each one with many alien races perhaps needing another incarnation, he therefore entertains the idea that there could be an infinite amount of gods. Also, the fact that he isn't certain makes no difference. To even say that there might be multiple incarnations is to promote polytheism and completely deny the Catholic faith. In fact, polytheists often claim to believe in one God. Many Mormons reject being called polytheists, even though they heretically say the three persons each have different substances. But Mormons, like Akin, are polytheists because their premises entail polytheism. Akin even said this about Mormons in his book. Quote, "Having adopted a radically different understanding of the nature of God and man, Mormons have rejected the central mystery of the Christian faith." He's condemned out of his own mouth as a divine punishment for decades of sophistry, denying Catholic teaching and employing elaborate schemes in an attempt to exonerate heretics. God sent him a strong delusion, and he fell deeply into one of the few errors he explicitly condemns: polytheism. Jimmy Akin's errors on polytheism and parallel worlds are deep-seated and affect his interpretation of actual events. While giving his opinion on a paranormal location called Skinwalker Ranch, he said that demons try to lead us away from Mormonism.
How about we examine the faith perspective first? What about the faith perspective?
So one of the things that that a lot of people may think of is, okay, so they had this weird kind of poltergeist-like phenomena happening around the house where objects would vanish and reappear elsewhere. The groceries that had been unpacked would get repacked. That sounds kind of like a poltergeist, which sounds like it might be a demon. And then in the last of the tunnel incidents I mentioned, there's this sulfur smell. And you see this black humanoid thing wriggling out of the tunnel and go running off in the night through the night vision goggles. Well, could it be demons? Sure, it could be. But demons don't normally leave physical traces like this. And a lot of the things that they saw looked like hardware, like the RV aircraft and the other aircraft and even the blue orbs. NIDS got a lot of this, some of this anyway, we're able to record some of it. And we don't have a sense of, like, if it's demons, what are the demons trying to do here? Demons want to lead you away from God. That doesn't seem to have been part of what was happening here. There really wasn't any discussion. I mean, these are fallen away Mormons. They're not really practicing their faith already, and they're not led further away from it by what happens. So since we don't have like a possession with a demon taking credit for this stuff, it's kind of hard to pin this on demons, given all the technology that seems to be associated with this stuff. That doesn't seem to be the most likely explanation.
Although his statement blatantly contradicts his book, Why Mormonism is Not Christian, it's actually consistent with his polytheism. Thinking that demons want to lead people away from Mormonism indirectly indicates that Mormonism, i.e., polytheism, is actually the true religion. The reality is that demons promote polytheism, just like Akin. His conclusion regarding Skinwalker Ranch is that the phenomena is caused by beings from a parallel world.
There was, you mentioned the parallel world theory.
Yeah, so, if you say, you have kind of a basic choice of, if you say the reported phenomena, not in all the details, but they're either basically correct, the accounts of all this stuff is either basically correct or basically incorrect. If it's basically correct, what best explains this? It seems to me the answer would be some kind of bridge to another world, either a parallel world in another dimension, or another planet, or this planet in another time.
One wonders what god or gods does he think rule over this parallel world. The Catholic position on Skinwalker Ranch and UFOs are that they're demonic hoaxes. Read the book, UFOs, Demonic Activity and Elaborate Hoaxes Meant to Deceive Mankind, and watch the video, UFOs, Nephilim, Climate Change, and the Devil, for more information on this topic. But many who call themselves Catholic never fully trusted Catholic answers, and are more inclined towards someone like Dr. Taylor Marshall. They like Marshall because he appears more faithful to Catholic teachings. He's considered by many to be a strong traditional Catholic, but he actually makes the same errors as Akin, but in a less obvious and ridiculous manner. Just like Akin, he's unable to condemn heretics, and also has confused Catholicism with polytheism. Taylor Marshall is in fact an end-times deceiver who was preternaturally called by the devil to deceive more traditionally minded people. Marshall, like most modern personalities that claim to be Catholic, understands the power and influence of Catholic answers. He and his co-host, Timothy Gordon, discuss how Akin continues to defend Francis's heretical Amoris Laetitia, which states the heresy that people committing the mortal sin of adultery can receive communion. Not once did they call Akin a heretic.
This to settle on people. It settled last summer, so fine, better late than never. Got it. Everyone who's on the right side now is on the right side now. But
not necessarily. Let's remember our Jimmy Akin has been battling all week.
Yeah, but he ain't on the right side.
I know,
but I'm saying. I don't.
But he represents Catholic Answers and Catholic Radio, and it's still in 2019 a social media feud over Amoris Laetitia and all these things. Like,
you mean among even non-communists in the church? He's certainly not that. He's not a
people listening to Catholic Answers or on the way home from work, right, are hearing a lot of this stuff for the first time. And,
no, it's true.
And Jimmy Akin is trying to shore it up, but the dam's broken, man.
Now listen to this. Instead of condemning Akin for publicly defending the heretical teaching that adulterers can lawfully receive communion, they instead cheerfully invite him to come to their side.
He's one of the stragglers.
Yeah, I mean he's putting all of his fingers and thumbs in the holes of damn things blown open. Come on, Jimmy. Come on over, Jimmy.
Come on.
Your cowboy hat. Come on, man. Come on.
We'll take you.
Marshall knows Akin defends Amoris Laetitia, but doesn't condemn him, even though Akin's promotion of Amoris is in no way nuanced or subtle. He blatantly endorses the teaching that adulterers can receive communion. Akin uses the ridiculous and heretical excuse that people need to specifically know and understand something is a mortal sin for it to be a mortal sin. That isn't a requirement, because if it was, then one could avoid mortal sins by not reading the Catechism, which is ridiculous. Now listen to Akin defend Amoris Laetitia. Quote, ongoing sexual relations in an invalid marriage provide the grave matter, but they don't mean the knowledge and deliberation conditions are met. A person could, through inadequate catechesis, lack a proper understanding of the sinfulness of these acts. Consequently, some divorced and civilly remarried Catholics who continue to have sexual relations would not be committing mortal sin. But since Marshall and Gordon are deceivers, they are unwilling or unable to condemn Akin's defense of Amoris Laetitia as heretical. Another example of Marshall not rightfully condemning heretics is with, quote, Bishop Robert Barron. Barron is one of the most famous personalities claiming to be Catholic in the world. He and his organization, Word on Fire, are well known for promoting the false doctrine that perhaps everyone who has ever lived will be saved. He cites a famous heretical theologian named Hans Urs von Balthasar to argue that we can hope that all men will be saved. This is heresy. It's contrary to Catholic dogma and the very words of Christ. People like Barron, who promote it, are heretics and must be condemned by the faithful. Marshall and Gordon discussed Barron's promotion of hopeful universalism on their show, and neither Marshall nor Gordon explicitly said that Barron is a heretic. They were too busy admiring Barron.
Filial piety in love, in restraint, and respect. I will say this to Bishop Barron.
Marshall and Gordon are so consumed with human respect for Barron that they're perplexed at his promotion of Balthasar and hopeful universalism. Listen to Gordon's consternation that someone he's inclined to like is spreading a false theology.
To me, I want to give some credit where it's due. Bishop Barron, I watched a lot of his videos when I returned to teaching 6 years ago. And just as a fast forward, he seems like that kind of guy in a lot of ways. That's the good kind that's excited by reason. I mean, really, he a couple of his videos got me excited just about the proofs. I mean, he really seems like that kind of guy. So I don't understand the connection to von Balthasar, if I'm right about the other thing.
Balthasarianism is overtly satanic because it gives people a false hope in salvation. If one believes all men are saved, it follows that one isn't going to work very hard for their salvation. The hard truth is that few men are saved. Besides giving people a diabolical false hope, Balthasarianism also has its roots in false mysticism and the occult. Even though Marshall and Gordon are aware of this, they still won't condemn Barron. Listen to Marshall talk about the false mysticism that Balthasarianism is based on.
What? So you want me to bank on Balthasar? Who, by the way, based his theology on these bogus mystical revelations of Adrian von Speyer, who was a twice-divorced Protestant convert into Catholicism who claimed to have these visions. Balthasar left the Jesuits and teamed up with her, started the community of St. John, and based on her visions of Christ's descent into hell, revamped, or according to Barron, had a development of doctrine.
Hopeful universalism is a heresy, and Hans Urs von Balthasar, the man who popularized it, was both a heretic and an occultist. He actually wrote the afterword to an occult book that claimed to be Christian called Meditations on the Tarot. This is a book written by an anonymous author and is a guided quote meditation with each chapter on a different tarot card. The chapter on the Devil Tarot card states, in so many words, that we should learn spiritually from many sources, including Kabbalists, Rosicrucians, esotericists, theosophists, and occultists. By writing positively about this book and doing its afterword, Balthasar shows himself to be an occultist. In the afterword, he boldly calls the occult author a, quote, Christian of unmistakable purity. Listen to this excerpt where Balthazar heretically attempts to merge Catholicism with Tarot mysticism. Quote, "A thinking, praying Christian of unmistakable purity reveals to us the symbols of Christian Hermeticism in its various levels of mysticism, gnosis, and magic. By way of the major arcana, the author seeks to lead meditatively into the deeper, all-embracing wisdom of the Catholic mystery." Marshall is aware of Balthazar's connection to the occult and commented on it in a video.
Get this, Tim. He was into the occult. This is not just gossip. He wrote the foreword for a book called Meditations on the Tarot.
Even though Marshall is aware of the occult roots of Balthasarianism, he doesn't condemn Balthazar or Barron for believing it. As a matter of fact, Marshall doesn't even clearly condemn the doctrine as heresy. He says things like, "I ain't buying it."
And you're going to push this book across the table? I ain't buying it.
And "I'm not going to go there."
Sorry, Von Balthazar. I'm not going to go there.
Also, he compares Balthazar's heretical theology to someone stealing his wallet.
Right.
Anytime I hear that kind of argument, I'm running away. I'm like, I'm afraid you're going to steal my wallet. This is right. A trick. This is a trick.
Marshall and Gordon were so weak in this show, they later commented how they were tripping over themselves in an attempt to be respectful to Barron.
We were tripping over ourselves. I rewatched that whole show of ours yesterday and listened to it. And we were tripping over ourselves to be professional and respectful.
Hey, when I came.
Also, in this next clip, notice how Marshall calls the doctrine of hopeful universalism controversial and not heretical.
We grant all that. And yes, has he done some good? As Frad said, of course. But since when can that be, well, let's not talk about a doctrine that's controversial?
Marshall knows that hopeful universalism is a doctrine with diabolical roots. In the face of this knowledge, he doesn't condemn those who believe and promote it as outright heretics. Like Akin, Marshall's false theology and human respect prevent him from calling people heretics. He repeats Akin's errors, and like Akin, he calls Protestants brothers and sisters.
In our world, in our Catholic world. The shame of it, though, Tim, is that it's the Protestant brothers and sisters who are leading this fight.
Marshall also apparently has no respect for the anathemizations made against the Protestants at the Council of Trent. Even the Protestants are aware that they were anathematized by Trent. Marshall, also like Akin, conflates Catholicism with polytheism. According to Marshall, one can openly participate in the worship of false gods and not be a heretic. To believe one can worship false gods and not become a heretic is to believe that Catholicism is compatible with polytheism. For example, at the Amazon Synod, the world saw Francis commit public idolatry. A pagan tree planting ceremony was held in which Francis took part. Idols of the pagan goddess Pachamama were placed around Rome for adoration. For a time, there was a desperate cover story that these idols were actually an Amazonian depiction of the Virgin Mary. But Marshall knows this to be a falsehood, since Francis identified the idols by calling them Pachamama, the name of the pagan goddess that they represent.
Francis, you even used the word Pachamama. You identified them with the Amazonian goddess.
Marshall knows well that the statues are pagan idols. He knows Francis participated in the idolatrous ceremony. Yet, he still won't conclude that Francis is a heretic. He even desperately asked Francis on a YouTube video if he was a heretic.
Francis, we also want to know, are you a heretic?
When confronted with someone who's openly engaging in and promoting idolatry, he can't determine whether or not the person is a heretic. Hence his question. He therefore holds that it's possible that one can engage in and promote idolatry and not become a heretic. What Francis did, however, isn't just idolatry. It's also polytheism. Here's how. Francis claims, on some level, to believe in and worship the Trinity. So by worshiping Pachamama, a pagan goddess, he has committed a public act of polytheism. He, by his actions, professed his belief in two deities, the Holy Trinity and Pachamama. This is polytheism. In that video, Marshall appeared surprised and uncomfortable with Francis's actions, as if this is a new development that more traditionally minded people need to wrestle with, as if Francis's worship of the Pachamama idol is some unprecedented action. But Marshall knows that Francis's actions are nothing new. He knows this quite well and even said so in his book, Infiltration, in which he admitted that John Paul II engaged in and promoted idolatry. When discussing John Paul II's Assisi prayer meeting, he said this, quote, John Paul II's participating in and encouraging pagan idolatry in a Catholic basilica. His book, Infiltration, documented details about the idolatry John Paul II promoted. Quote, most scandalous of all was that the Tibetan Buddhist delegation led by the Dalai Lama were allowed to place an idol of Buddha on top of a Catholic tabernacle in the chapel of San Pietro, as reported by the New York Times. To this idol they burned incense within a Catholic church, with permission from John Paul II. But despite admitting, in writing, that John Paul II participated in and encouraged idolatry, and gave others explicit permission to do likewise, Marshall, in the same chapter of that book, says John Paul II, quote, maintained his devotion to the Eucharist, and, quote, retained the piety of a Catholic. Listen to this from Infiltration. Quote, John Paul II moved freely in these ideals while still maintaining his old-world Polish devotions for Eucharistic adoration, the Rosary, confession, and processions. As a theologian and a youthful bishop, he drank deeply of Vatican II, but he still retained the piety of a Catholic. Idolaters who promote polytheism are certainly not pious, nor do they have any devotion to the Eucharist. Not only does Marshall say that John Paul II, quote, retained the piety of a Catholic, but he also referred to John Paul II as, quote, canonized and a, quote, saint in his book, Infiltration. Quote, John Paul II was generally seen as doctrinally conservative, and he upheld the Church's traditional teachings. He was canonized in April 2014. In that same book, he gives a, quote, timeline of popes, and in it, he refers to John Paul II as, quote, Saint John Paul II. To say a public idolater is a saint is apostasy and a denial of the Catholic faith. How can Marshall be so inconsistent? How can he say that when John Paul II engaged in the worship of false gods, he, quote, retained the piety of a Catholic and is a, quote, saint, yet when Francis worshipped Pachamama, also a false god, now he has a public breakdown?
And I'll tell you right now, I will never do it. I will never do it. You will kill me before I expose my children to these things. You will literally have to kill me.
John Paul II and Francis both committed the same sin. In fact, Francis's polytheistic Amazon Synod even ended on the 33rd anniversary of John Paul II's polytheistic Assisi prayer meeting. The reason Marshall is compelled to defend John Paul II and not Francis is because he's under the dark spiritual control of the Antichrist. John Paul II was in fact the Antichrist foretold in the book of Revelation. John Paul II was the sixth king of Rome because of the 1929 Lateran Treaty. He was wounded and healed in the 1981 assassination attempt, and his image was venerated in the, quote, beatification and, quote, canonization ceremonies. Now, John Paul II is venerated all over the world as a saint. He's a false saint raised up by the devil to be the central figure in the end times Vatican II counterchurch. That's why people who claim to be traditionalists, like Marshall, will compulsively defend John Paul II, yet harshly criticize Francis for essentially the same thing. They're under dark preternatural influence and are used by the devil to keep more traditionally inclined people in the Vatican II counterchurch. Marshall discussed a spiritual experience he had regarding John Paul II and Benedict XVI on the show, The Journey Home.
But first, since you're a returning guest, if you would give us a summary of how the Lord opened your heart to the church.
When answering, he pointed to an experience he had regarding John Paul II's death when he was an Episcopalian, quote, seminarian.
And but along the way, and especially in seminary, during that time, John Paul II died, and I had this reaction that even though I'd never been in the same room or even in the same city with John Paul II, just a feeling of his impact in the world, even an emotional impact, oddly enough.
When John Paul II died, a man who he admits participated in idolatry, he had a spiritual experience. The reality is that the spiritual experience he had was him being called by the devil to be one of the final end times deceivers. The devil took an Episcopalian, quote, priest and repurposed him into the ultimate false traditionalist. Marshall then went on to have a second preternatural experience. He went to Rome, where, quote, miraculous things happened, and attended a, quote, mass with Benedict XVI, and felt transfigured.
And in Rome, just many miraculous things happened. We were able to go to mass with the Holy Father, Pope Benedict, and to see a lot of the, beautiful shrines, and to meet a cardinal who really pushed me towards getting back to Texas and talking to Bishop Van in Fort Worth about coming into the church. And he gave me a rosary from the Pope, and all those experiences sort of came together. It was like a transfiguration moment.
Benedict XVI is the man who, quote, beatified John Paul II. He encouraged the world to believe the lie that idolaters are, quote, holy and to be venerated. Just like his evil predecessor, John Paul II, he participated in and encouraged idolatry. He followed in the footsteps of the pagan Assisi meeting and held Assisi III. Yet, Benedict XVI somehow has the false reputation of being conservative. Marshall, however, admits that Benedict XVI is not a conservative when discussing how Benedict chose liberals to become, quote, cardinals, like the extremely liberal Tagle.
About it. Now, I got a big red pill for everybody. So everybody get a glass of water, a big glass of water, or a shot glass with some Jack Daniels in it. Guess who appointed this liberal, crazy Filipino Tagle to the College Cardinals? B16.
Benedict, yep.
Benedict XVI, folks. Y'all need to realize that Benedict XVI is not this arch conservative that we were all told that he was. He is not. Yes, he's to the right of Francis, but he said Francis's pontificate is in continuity with his own.
Marshall's experiences were him falling under the influence of the devil and the beginning of his transformation into the ultimate false traditionalist. His defense of John Paul II also sheds light on his inability to condemn Barron as a heretic, because John Paul II, like Barron, promoted Balthasar in his theology. John Paul II even gave Balthasar an award in 1984 and wanted to make him a, quote, cardinal. Marshall realizes on some level that if he condemned Barron, he would logically also have to condemn John Paul II, something he's unwilling to do. One thing that distinguishes this crisis from the other crises in church history is that in this crisis, the devil has set up deceivers from across the ideological spectrum. Never before has there been such a phenomenon where simultaneously numerous groups exist falsely claiming to be Catholic, with so many varying opinions regarding major issues. But of the deceivers, who are more conservative, i.e., false traditionalists, Dr. Taylor Marshall has become the devil's most effective tool. He's more effective than other false traditionalists, like Michael Voris and Michael Matt, because unlike them, he doesn't avoid the true position of Sedevacanism. No, he directly attacks it, and gives the appearance that he's covering all the issues. His attacks not only have no merit, but actually constitute his most diabolical deception because, at this point, accepting the truth of Sedevacantism is of the utmost importance.
I'm not a Sedevacantist. Most people know that.
Sedevacantism is the only consistent explanation for the current crisis. It's the position that the Vatican II claimants to the papacy, from John the 23rd to Francis, are antipopes, because they are heretics, and have no papal authority whatsoever. According to Catholic dogma, heretics cannot hold office in the Church, because heretics are automatically severed from the Church. Pope Pius XII, Mystici Corporis Christi, quote, "For not every sin, however grave it may be, is such as of its own nature to sever a man from the body of the Church, as does schism or heresy or apostasy." Because they are outside the Catholic Church, they are unable to hold church office. Pope Leo XIII, Satis Cognitum, quote, "It is absurd to imagine that he who is outside can command in the Church." A heretic cannot be the Pope, since one who is outside the Church cannot be the head of that which he's not even a member. That's why Pope Paul IV issued a bull called Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio, explicitly declaring the election of a heretic as Pope to be null and void. The Vatican II claimants to the papacy are all heretical antipopes. Their actions have no authority whatsoever. Therefore, the Vatican II Council, closed by antipope Paul VI, had no binding authority, nor did the, quote, beatification and, quote, canonization of antipope John Paul II, done by antipope Benedict XVI and antipope Francis, respectively. But Marshall continually deceives his audience by addressing the issue of Sedevacantism, then boldly rejecting it. Listen to this segment of TNT where Marshall rejects Sedevacantism. In this clip, he repeatedly employs strawman argumentation against Sedevacantism, claiming that Sedevacantists say that there is no church and no papacy.
We agree that there still is a church. We're not Sedevacantists, like, yep, God just said no more papacy, end times, or whatever however you want to interpret it.
Sedevacantists don't argue that there's no church. They argue that the remnant of true Catholics who hold the faith are the Church. They don't argue that there's no papacy, but that the seat of the papacy is vacant, like the period between when a pope dies and a new one is elected. This period is also called a papal interregnum. There have been multiple Sedevacane periods throughout history because of papal deaths and elections, so it's disingenuous to act like Sedevacantism is impossible. Although Marshall continually pushes the strawman that Sedevacantists claim that there's no more papacy, he seems to know that's not true. Listen to this telling clip.
Some trads, like I said, Sedevacantist, like, yeah, we got to go back to 1958 because that's when the papacy was lost or whatever. And maybe they don't. I don't know. They're probably going to correct us.
Marshall shows he doesn't care about accurately representing Sedevacantism. He deceives his audience with a strawman argument, then admits, in so many words, that he actually doesn't know what he's talking about. Marshall and Gordon also claim Sedevacantists don't have a consistent explanation for Fatima, because they misrepresent the positions. They wrongly state that Sedevacantists claim that Russia has not yet been consecrated to the Blessed Virgin Mary, as she prophesied that it would be at Fatima.
There is a contradiction in their position because
Yes.
Sister Lucy, all over her memoirs, all over Secret 2, talks about a pope must consecrate Russia.
And that it will happen.
And that it will happen. So they have to downshift to saying, well, we meant the real failures to consecrate Russia were the actual last popes, including Pius
The 12th.
The most famous Sedevacantist organization in the world, VaticanCatholic.com, addressed this topic in great detail in a YouTube video called The Third Secret of Fatima, The Impostor Sister Lucia, and the End of the World, and argued that Pius XII did consecrate Russia and fulfill Our Lady's prophecy contained in the second secret. Our Lady never prophesied that it would be accomplished with all the bishops. That was a request Our Lady made. but she only prophesied that the Pope would end up doing it, which is exactly what happened. Quote, "In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and it will be converted, and a certain period of peace will be granted to the world." Pope Pius XII fulfilled this prophecy. This has been argued by Sedevikanis for many years, and is explained in great detail on a YouTube video with over 800,000 views.
Many believe that the Vatican II, quote, popes must be true popes, because one of them will finally consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But many do not know that Pope Pius XII specifically consecrated Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary on July 7, 1952. Pope Pius XII, in a formal act, consecrated Russia. He said, quote, "Today we consecrate, and in a most special manner we entrust all the peoples of Russia to this Immaculate Heart."
The Holy Father, Pope Pius XII, consecrated Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart. What happened afterwards? The communist regime fell, the Cold War ended, and Russia was converted to peace. The conversion Our Lady was speaking of was not a conversion to the Catholic faith, but a conversion to peace, similar to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 7. Here's another clip from that same video.
In the Bible, in Proverbs 16, verse 7, Almighty God himself also uses the word conversion, not to mean a conversion to the true faith, but a conversion of a persecuting enemy to peace, to a cessation of his persecuting ways.
But Marshall, like the other false traditionalists, disastrously misreads Fatima and concludes that we are not in the last days. His thoughts are basically that Mary said in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph, and this must mean a mass conversion to the Catholic faith. Since no mass conversion has happened yet, this must mean that we're not in the last days.
Is this the apocalypse? Is this the tribulation? Is this the end? Has Rome lost the faith? And he pointed to some important insights from saints, prophets, mystics, private revelation, Professor Plinio of TFP, that there will be a time of trial, but then there will be a great time of renewal, both in the church and in the political sphere, and that this is what theologians and mystics have called the reign of Mary, or the age of the Holy Spirit. Because we know Our Lady of Fatima says, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. So we can't be in the end yet because that hasn't happened.
Marshall gets Fatima backwards. Fatima is a sign of the end, not of a coming restoration. Sister Lucia, one of the seers of Fatima, even said in an interview that we're in the last times. For a full explanation of Fatima and the third secret, watch the video, The Third Secret of Fatima. But Marshall and Gordon dishonestly claim that Sedevikanis have, quote, nothing to say on the consecration and the era of peace.
But then it's like, okay, but what about the era of peace after the consecration? What about Russia's good role? They have nothing to say. They have nothing to
say on that.
This is a complete lie. The reality is that a well-known video done by Sedevikanis, which gives a logical and consistent explanation of all their objections, has been online and viewed more than 800,000 times over the last decade, long before Marshall even claimed to be a traditionalist. But instead of addressing the arguments, he claims that no arguments exist, and then rejects Sedevikanism based on this falsehood.
I mean, this is why I'm not a Sedevicantist.
He also implied that Sedevikanism is impossible because it took some time for people to realize that the chair of Peter was empty.
There's no one out there who in 1958 called up somebody and said, hey, there's no pope after that election.
Right.
So the theology of Sedevikanis really woke up in the 70s. Mid to late 70s is when you have Sedevikanism. So basically, no one knew the truth about the Pope, according to them, for 15, 17 years on planet Earth.
His argument was so flimsy that even his co-host Gordon chimed in to make a counterpoint in defense of the Sedevikanis.
But that's fair. I'm not saying they're right, but that would be fair because it takes the unfurling of the 60s.
Yeah, but
The devil, not wanting people to see the truth of the Sedevacantist position, moves Marshall to counter by inventing another straw man argument, arguing that Sedevacantists claim that if anyone is in communion with an antipope, they're automatically non-Catholic.
Of the 60s. Yeah, but they say if you're in communion with a false pope, you're not a Catholic. And all those guys were in communion with John the 23rd and Paul the 6th. So that means there were no Catholics on earth until someone realized that the See of Peter was vacant.
But again, he misrepresents the Sedevacantist position. Sedevacantists don't say that if you're in communion with an antipope, you're automatically non-Catholic. That's why he doesn't cite any sources. One can be confused about who the true pope is, or if there even is a pope, and not ipso facto lose the Catholic faith. VaticanCatholic.com wrote an article about how St. Vincent Ferrer was mistaken about who the true pope was during the Great Western Schism. In a similar way, many Catholics, like Padre Pio, were simply confused or unaware of the situation and wrongly thought that John the 23rd and Paul the 6th were true popes. The devil knew, as we came closer to the end of the world, that the true Sedevacantist position would become more and more obvious. Anti-Pope Francis's actions started to trigger consternation among those claiming to be Catholic. His heresy and apostasy started becoming totally obvious, especially with his promotion of adultery in Amoris Laetitia and public idolatry at the Amazon Synod. With all these abominable things happening, many people would start considering that perhaps the Sedevacantists are right. But the devil had a plan. He knew that he couldn't use any of his usual false traditionalist deceivers, like the Remnant and Church Militant. They weren't going to be convincing, since they've almost entirely avoided addressing Sedevacantism for many years. So the devil raised up Dr. Taylor Marshall, a man he had preternaturally called into his service many years ago via the Antichrist, Antipope John Paul II.
A feeling of his impact in the world, even an emotional impact.
A man he diabolically transfigured via the apostate Antipope Benedict XVI.
Came together as like a transfiguration moment.
Marshall is naturally likable, charismatic, formally educated with a PhD in philosophy, and portrays himself as confident and knowledgeable. No wonder this is who the devil handpicked to, in the last days, repeatedly mislead people away from the true position of Sedevacantism, and in front of an ever-growing audience. Marshall defends the Vatican II counterchurch from the ideological right, while James Martin and Jimmy Akin defend it from the ideological left. And because Taylor Marshall rejects Sedevacantism, he's inclined to defend Vatican II, even though he'll say it's not infallible. Some of Vatican II's heresies already mentioned in this video include Protestants being brothers and sisters in Christ, and dogmas needing to be received by the faithful in order to be binding. Vatican II was closed by Paul VI, an anti-pope. For this reason, it's not binding, nor is it infallible, but it's an end-times robber council orchestrated by the devil. In executing this diabolical plan, the devil realized many people would detect problems with Vatican II, so he had his human instrument, Antipope Paul VI, claim, in an informal manner, that Vatican II wasn't magisterial. In other words, it isn't infallible. Listen to Marshall discuss this statement of Paul VI.
Everyone agrees this is a different council. And then to have the Pope, Vicar of Christ, the day before the whole thing closes, say, quote, I'll read it again for everybody. The magisterium of the church did not wish to pronounce itself under the form of extraordinary dogmatic pronouncements.
It's weird. I mean,
but Vatican II was closed in solemn language, meaning that if Paul VI were a true pope, the council would have been infallible. Listen to the solemn language with which he closed the council. Quote, with our apostolic authority, we decide, moreover, that all that has been established synodally is to be religiously observed by all the faithful. Were Paul VI the Pope, Vatican II would be infallible, since it was closed in a solemn manner. But false traditionalists like Marshall cling to an informal statement of Paul VI and use that to argue both that Paul VI was a true pope and that Vatican II could contain errors. But the false traditionalist position gets even more desperate and contradictory. Although they'll state that Vatican II might have errors and that it isn't infallible, they will still act like it is infallible. Listen to this from Marshall's book, Infiltration, where he writes about Paul VI's statement that Vatican II wasn't infallible. Quote, Paul VI clarified this a little over 1 month later when he explained, in view of the pastoral nature of the council, it has avoided proclaiming in an extraordinary manner any dogma carrying the mark of infallibility. By a divine miracle, the Pope of Vatican II taught that Vatican II contained no extraordinary dogma and did not carry the mark of infallibility, meaning the documents of Vatican II are fallible and may contain error. Marshall called Paul VI's informal statement a, quote, divine miracle. This indicates that he thinks the teachings contained in Vatican II are erroneous. But contradictorily, Marshall defends Vatican II and its documents as if it were infallible. Now listen to him defend the Vatican II document, Lumen Gentium, and notice how he sums up the teaching by saying that Muslims and Catholics worship the same God.
For example, Muslims worship the same God as Catholics. I know that there's a way, because I've done it before, to make that work.
His summation is accurate. Vatican II teaches that Muslims and Catholics worship the same God. At this, many will point out that Allah, the Muslim term for their, quote, God, means God in Arabic, and that some Bibles even translate God as Allah. But this is a semantical diversion. Vatican II is, without any doubt, referring specifically to the Islamic understanding of Allah. In fact, Nostra Aetate, another Vatican II document, uses the term Faith of Islam. Therefore, it is talking about the Islamic Allah. Thus, just to be totally clear, when I say Allah in this video, going forward, I am referring to the Islamic Allah. Marshall defends the diabolical teaching that Muslims and Catholics worship the same God by saying there's a way to make the teaching, quote, work.
To make that work.
By saying he can, quote, make it work, it means he thinks the teaching is true, but just poorly phrased. He accepts the teaching and its implications. He follows it to its logical conclusion, which is that Allah is really the Trinity. To put it more explicitly, the logical conclusion would be that Allah is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Following that same logic, it could also be said that Allah is Jesus Christ. Vatican II really does teach that Allah is Jesus Christ. In Lumen Gentium, it states, quote, the Muslims, who, professing to hold the faith of Abraham, along with us adore the one and merciful God, who on the last day will judge mankind. Vatican II is teaching that the God the Muslims adore will judge mankind on the last day. The God the Muslims adore is Allah, but the Apostles' Creed specifies that Jesus Christ will judge us on the last day. Therefore, Vatican II teaches that Allah is Jesus Christ. Marshall understands this, and although he seems to find it somewhat inconvenient, he defends it. In this next clip, perhaps in an unguarded moment, he admits the logical conclusion of Vatican II's teaching on the Muslims. Marshall explains how, according to him, it could be said that at the Holy Mass the priest offers a sacrifice to Allah, and likewise, it could be said that Muslims worship the Trinity. He mentions how the, quote, man on the street doesn't agree with this, but then adds that the statements should just, quote, probably be removed. This creates the implication that although the, quote, man on the street doesn't realize this, people like him, who have PhDs in philosophy, understand this, quote, truth, which the average layman is not quite able to comprehend.
But in reality, when you're talking to the man on the street and you say, at the Holy Mass, does the Catholic priest offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass to Allah? They're like, no. Right? And if you ask a Muslim,
hey, do you worship the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost? I'm like, no, I don't worship. Right? Man on the street, both the Muslim and the Catholic, doesn't agree with that.
Sure.
You know, it should probably just be removed.
Marshall accurately portrays the teaching of Vatican II, and, even though he doesn't think it's infallible, he still defends it as if it were. In fact, he even wrote on his blog that the statements on the Muslims in Vatican II's Lumen Gentium are 100% correct. Like many who attempt to defend Vatican II's teaching on the Muslims and Islam, Marshall tries to argue that Muslims are no different from those who have simply concluded through the natural light of reason that God exists. Vatican I does teach that man can know there is a God through the natural light of reason. This teaching of Vatican I is a key part of Marshall's sophistry used to defend Vatican II's teaching on the Muslims. In his article, he referenced this teaching of Vatican I and asserted that Muslims have certain rational conclusions about God. This is part one of the argument Marshall, and others, make. They assert that Muslims have many true beliefs about the nature of God, and, because of this, fulfill the criteria of knowing God through the light of reason. This is why in his article, he refers to Muslim worship/adoration as insufficient. He calls Muslim worship insufficient instead of condemning it as positively corrupt and misdirected. He uses an analogy of a bow and arrow to make the argument that Muslims' worship is going the right direction but can't hit the target. This is from his article. Quote, "So Muslims should be recognized as further along the path than other non-Christians, but their rejection of the Trinity and their rejection of Christ as the Son of God means that their arrow of adoration cannot reach the intended target." After making the earlier assertion that Muslims know the true God through the natural light of reason, they will then argue that despite Muslims' rejection of the Trinity and the Incarnation, their adoration is still directed towards the true God, but just in some kind of weaker form. This line of thinking is illogical and wicked. If Muslims worship Allah, and their worship is somehow directed towards the true God, then the inescapable conclusion would be that Allah is, in fact, the true God. This belief is a heresy and a grave error. It's built out of many smaller errors. The first problem with this belief is that it presupposes that non-Catholics can truly worship God. It's actually a dogma that only Catholics can truly worship God. Pope Gregory XVI, Sumo Yugitar Studio, quote, "Therefore, they must instruct them in the true worship of God, which is unique to the Catholic religion." But a Vatican II defender will object and say that Vatican II never used the words true worship or true adoration in Lumen Gentium or Nostra Aetate. Yes, the word true was never used, but the documents still convey the view that Muslims truly worship God. They simply use different words to carry the same meaning. Listen to these excerpts from Vatican II. Quote, "The Muslims, they adore the one God. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable decrees. They worship God especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting." And listen to Lumen Gentium heretically teach that Muslims are on the same level or right beside Catholics in regards to adoration of the one true God. Quote, "The Muslims, who, along with us, adore the one and merciful God." Vatican II absolutely teaches that Muslims, along with Catholics, truly worship God. This is contrary to Catholic teaching. Marshall then erroneously conflates an insufficient knowledge of God with a positive rejection and corruption of the faith. Those who have derived some true knowledge of God purely by the use of reason are totally different than those who positively corrupt and reject the faith. A legitimate example of a person who has derived knowledge of the true God through the light of reason would be a child raised in a secular household, ignorant of Christianity, if, when this child arrives at the use of reason, he decides that his parents are wrong and that there must be a God, who is the creator, then that's the first step towards conversion. This child does not truly worship God. He simply used the light of reason to know God a little bit. This child could be said to have an insufficient knowledge of God, since his small amount of knowledge is insufficient for a conversion through baptism. Marshall makes the heretical argument that being a Muslim is similar to a secular child reasoning that God exists. This is precisely why he uses the word insufficient in regard to Muslims. He then combines that with the heretical belief that non-Catholics can truly worship God. He also claims St. Thomas Aquinas agrees with him, but Aquinas condemns his assessment. The important difference between the secular child and the Muslim is that the secular child does not have a false opinion of God. He has an insufficient one. Believing in one God, who is the Creator, does not contradict Catholic teaching. It fits like a puzzle piece. But Muslims are quite different. They positively believe things that are explicitly contrary to the true faith. They aren't ignorant of the Trinity and the Incarnation like the secular child. They positively reject those doctrines. According to Aquinas, Muslims' false teachings on God not only show that they don't worship Him, but that they don't even know Him at all. Quote, "By false knowledge of God, man does not approach Him, but is severed from Him. Nor is it possible for one who has a false opinion of God to know Him in any way at all, because the object of his opinion is not God." False religions, like Islam, are a creation of Satan. Marshall's bow and arrow analogy is false and heretical. Muslims don't aim their worship at the true God. They aim it at a demon. Marshall, like many heretics, has conflated ignorance of the true faith with a positive rejection and corruption of the faith. But there's another layer to Marshall's heretical defense of Vatican II's Lumen Gentium. Remember part 1 of his argument where he asserted that, quote, Muslims technically have a rational conclusion that God is one, simple, etc.? He asserted this to make it seem like Muslims' belief about Allah are at least within the confines of the truths about God that could be attained through the natural light of reason. Let's call these the natural truths about God. In Marshall's article, he gives 2 examples, then says etc. His use of etc. implies that Islam gets many or perhaps even all of these natural truths correct. But this is false. Not only does the religion of Islam explicitly reject divinely revealed truths, but it also does not even hold to the natural truths about God. For example, notice how Marshall claims that Muslims believe that Allah is, quote, one and simple. He argues that Muslims basically believe in divine simplicity, which is the Catholic doctrine that God is not composed of parts of any kind, and all that God is, including any attributes, are not really distinct from each other or from God, but are actually identical with God's essence. The problem with Marshall's argument that Allah is, quote, one and simple, is that Muslims in general don't believe this, and, in fact, the largest Islamic faction, Sunni Islam, as a whole, totally rejects it. It's a well-known teaching within Islam that the Quran is considered to be an eternal attribute of Allah, and is, in a sense, an aspect of Allah. But, even though they will say that the Quran is an eternal, uncreated attribute of Allah, somehow, it's also not Allah. This belief, besides making no sense and being a total contradiction, is incompatible with divine simplicity. This belief, that the Quran is eternal and uncreated, is widely held within believers of Sunni Islam. About 90% of those claiming to be Muslim identify as Sunni. There are approximately 1.5 billion Sunni Muslims worldwide. This belief, that the Quran is an eternal, uncreated attribute of Allah, is a blatant rejection of divine simplicity, since it claims Allah has an attribute that isn't really Allah. Some Muslims realize how damaging this belief is to their arguments, and reject it on those grounds. Listen to a Muslim apologist who rejects this particular teaching explain how nonsensical it is.
You know, this whole debate of the Quran is uncreated and stuff like this is nonsense.
So it is Muslim.
This whole debate is pathetic. stupid. It's caused a lot of unnecessary confusion, and it's rendered Muslims, exposed Muslims to vulnerabilities they didn't actually have. So this whole argument of saying that this is him, the Quran is God but it's not God, it just renders Muslims incredibly vulnerable. It makes no sense.
Contrary to Marshall's assertion, Muslims as a whole do not believe Allah is one or simple. The majority position of the Islamic scholars is that the Quran is an eternal uncreated attribute of Allah, a position that is incompatible with divine simplicity. Although this Muslim apologist rejects the teaching that the Quran is eternal, other Muslims will say that to deny the Quran is eternal is to disbelieve and reject Islam. The following quote is from a website run by a Muslim scholar named Sheikh Muhammad Al-Munajid. This website is ranked by Alexa as one of the most popular websites in the world regarding the subject of Islam. Quote, "The Quran comes under the heading of his words or speech, which is one of his attributes. Therefore, whoever says that it is created is a disbeliever. The Quran being an eternal attribute of Allah is a core teaching. This strange Islamic belief is proof that Muslims don't even hold the truths about God that could be attained through the natural light of reason. This Islamic belief not only denies divine simplicity, but since the Quran is considered an eternal attribute of Allah, it therefore follows that the Quranic verses that condemn the Trinity and the Incarnation are considered an eternal uncreated aspect of Allah. If taken to its logical conclusion, these blasphemous verses that condemn the Trinity and the Incarnation are, in a sense, Allah. Therefore, to worship Allah is to literally worship a denial of Christ and the Trinity. The Islamic belief that the Quran is uncreated is particularly important because it destroys the arguments of the Vatican II defenders on multiple levels. On one level, it denies divine simplicity, a truth that could be attained through the natural light of reason. And on another level, this same belief denies the Trinity and the Incarnation, since it claims that denying the Trinity and the Incarnation is actually an eternal uncreated aspect of Allah. This Islamic teaching, in one fell swoop, denies both the divinely revealed truths about God and the truths about God that could be attained through the natural light of reason. But what if someone makes the desperate objection that some Muslims believe in divine simplicity, and therefore Vatican II was only referring to them? They might even point out the Islamic school of thought called the Mu'tazila. This is an Islamic school of thought that rejects the idea that the Quran is eternal, and according to some sources, believed in divine simplicity. However, one of the many problems with this objection is that Vatican II did not specify a particular type of Muslim. It wasn't referring to a small subset of Muslims. It was referring to Muslims and Islam in general. Also, consider that the Vatican II antipopes, like Francis and Benedict XVI, met with various heads of Sunni Islam. This confirms that Vatican II's praise of Muslims extends to the Sunnis, the Islamic sect which believes that the Quran is an eternal uncreated attribute of Allah, a belief completely incompatible with divine simplicity. The teaching that Muslims worship the same God as Catholics, as taught in Vatican II and defended by Marshall, is not only indefensibly blasphemous, but it's actually polytheistic. Yes, Vatican II teaches polytheism. The teaching that Muslims worship the same God as Catholics is polytheism. Affirming the slogan that there's only one God doesn't make you a monotheist. Vatican II and Marshall are actually teaching a form of polytheism called soft polytheism. Here's a definition of soft polytheism from philosophybasics.com. Quote, "Soft polytheism, the belief in many gods and goddesses, which are considered to be manifestations or aspects of a single god, rather than completely distinct entities." Here's another definition from ancientorigins.net. Quote, Another type of polytheism is soft polytheism, which holds the view that while there are many deities, all of them are in fact manifestations or aspects of one divine being. To put it another way, soft polytheism is the inverted teaching of Psalm 95:5. Instead of all the other gods being devils, as the Bible teaches, soft polytheism would have us believe that all these other gods are just aspects/manifestations/fragments of the one true God. Also, soft polytheism isn't just some obscure philosophical definition that's never actually employed in real life. It's used widely by modern witches and neo-pagans to describe their spiritual beliefs. Here's the host of a pagan YouTube show discussing the term.
So, welcome back to another Thursday on The Pagan Perspective. I'm your Thursday host, Yeka. And this week we're talking about soft polytheism, or the label itself. So, our question comes from...
Marshall's position is that two beings, the Trinity and Allah, who both claim to be the only God, whose defined attributes contradict each other, both point to the same reality of the one true God. That's a perfect example of soft polytheism. Marshall believes that the Trinity and Allah are both legitimate aspects/expressions of the one true God. Like Akin and the Mormons, Marshall is a polytheist, claiming to be a Christian. Although people in the Vatican II counterchurch will typically extend their soft polytheism to the false god Allah, sometimes they go much further. For example, quote, Mother Teresa extended her soft polytheism to both Allah and the Hindu Ishwar. Also, don't be deceived by the fact that Marshall sometimes contradicts himself and articulates the correct position, like on July 16, 2020, when Marshall seemed to say that Muslims don't worship the true God.
But I mean, let's just ask ourselves, do Muslims with us adore the one true God? For example, at Mass, does Father offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass to Muhammad's God, to Allah? Does a Catholic priest offer Mass to the Allah of the Quran? I don't think so. It might be, it's news to them.
But a mere 10 days later, he published a video with, quote, Bishop Athanasius Schneider that again promoted the heresy that Muslims worship the same God as Catholics.
Of course, we could say that we adore one true God. The Muslims, they also adore the one God which exists.
Marshall not only uploaded this pre-recorded interview, knowing full well what Schneider said, but also boldly endorsed Schneider with regard to this specific interview, going so far as to call him a modern Saint Athanasius.
Athanasius Schneider is the real deal. He is the real deal. And everybody watching that new video that went up today on YouTube, on my channel, Taylor Marshall Show on YouTube, you watch that video, you want to see what a real Catholic bishop looks like, sounds like, talks like, prays like, go watch that YouTube video today. Interview with Bishop Athanasius Schneider. He wrote the foreword to my book, Infiltration. He's the best. He's holy. He is our new Saint Athanasius.
In that same interview, Schneider made the heretical argument that, quote, good Muslims believe in the, quote, one God, but only on a natural level. This is similar to Marshall's heretical bow and arrow argument.
Let us say of good Muslims who are maybe believing innocently in the one God, but they adore God always on a natural level.
In that same interview, Schneider, similar to Marshall, deceptively references Vatican I in order to give his heretical teaching on Muslims an air of legitimacy.
Whereas the Muslims. They adore the one God only on a natural level, according to the capacity, the ability of every human being of the natural knowledge of the existence of God. It's a dogma of faith, the First Vatican Council.
Marshall is a soft polytheist who uses his platform to promote the idea that Allah is the true God. But how can all these so-called teachers of Catholicism, in fact, be polytheists? This phenomenon isn't actually new. In fact, it's been preceded by something quite similar. During the Arian crisis, mostly everyone who claimed to be Catholic fell into Arianism, a form of polytheism that teaches the worship of multiple godlike beings. Arianism attacked the nature of Jesus by teaching that he was essentially a demigod. Arianism taught polytheism since it promoted the worship of both their heretical version of the Father, who they believed to be eternal, and their demigod version of Jesus, who they thought was created. This is a description of Arianism. Quote, according to Arianism's opponents, especially the bishop Saint Athanasius, Arius's teaching reduced the Son to a demigod and reintroduced polytheism, since the worship of the Son was not abandoned. During the Arian crisis, over 90% of the bishops fell into the polytheistic Arian belief and lost their church offices, and most lay people claiming to be Catholic imbibed these polytheistic Arian ideas and therefore ceased to be Catholic. The faithful were reduced to a remnant. In fact, Marshall even promotes the idea that the current crisis is worse than the Arian crisis. In an episode of his show with, quote, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, Marshall asked Schneider if the current crisis is worse than the Arian crisis.
And so, Your Excellency, do you think that the current crisis is less than, equal to, or worse than the great Arian crisis, the Arian heresy?
To my opinion, the current crisis is worse.
Although on the show, he promoted the idea that the current crisis is worse than the Arian crisis, he somehow thinks that essentially everyone claiming to be Catholic is actually Catholic, or approximately 1 billion people, and uses this number to convince himself that he's in the right church.
Worldwide billion-person Catholic Church.
St. Gregory Nazianz commented that the Arians also convinced themselves that they were in the true church because their heretical church had more people. Quote, where are they who revile us for our poverty and pride themselves in their riches? They who define the church by numbers and scorn the little flock? Just like the Arians, Marshall defines the church by numbers, not doctrine. And just like the Arians, he's fallen into a form of polytheism.
For example, Muslims worship the same God as Catholics. I know that there's a way, because I've done it before, to make that work.
The Vatican II Council and its heretical documents have facilitated the final return of polytheism in a more subtle and deceptive form. Although many people in the Vatican II Church, like Dr. Taylor Marshall, limit their soft polytheism mainly to the false Islamic god Allah, others, like Jimmy Akin, have adopted more extreme forms of polytheism. The Vatican II Church is a non-Catholic polytheistic sect that explicitly teaches soft polytheism in its official documents, such as Lumen Gentium, the Assisi Prayer Meeting of John Paul II, and the Amazon Synod of Francis are in continuity with this polytheistic teaching. St. Paul predicted that a great apostasy, a great falling away, would happen just prior to the second coming. This idea of a final crisis has also commonly been held throughout church history. Listen to Jimmy Akin admit that it's been long understood that there'll be a final crisis just prior to the second coming.
The term tribulation is used in a specialized sense to refer to a time of great trouble just before the second coming of Christ. And actually, that's an idea that Catholics don't have a problem with. If you look in the Catechism of the Catholic Church around paragraph 676, you'll find that it is understood that the Church is going to undergo a great crisis just before the second coming.
We're in that final crisis right now.